Ravenwood Audio presents Drugula by Michael Faun. Read for you by Travis Neisler. Exordium. Dream Gun Vampire. Terrakalatiai, Transylvania, 1803. The bloodthirsty mob, zealous men in black smocks and Kalimavkian hats, had driven the evil vampire, Count Drugula, all the way from Bogus to the Barkow River to once and for all rid the cursed region of its fanged plague, who for centuries had sucked the blood out of the veins of the people and their land. "I fear we have lost him," sighed Tristan, and offered his brother Dimitro a look of resignation. Behind their lead, God-fearing mercenaries whispered prayers while nervously tapping their sharpened stakes. Two of the youngest men wept.
"This is deplorable. My men trusted your strength and your leadership, as did the villagers. They wanted him dead, and you have failed to meet their desire."
"Forgive me, brother." As silence commenced between the two, a merciless mist began to spread across the bleak and barren landscape. A thick, encompassing white veil had made it impossible to advance yet another inch. It appeared sudden and ghost-like, as if conjured by black magic. And as quick as the eerie fog came, so did every trace of the fleeing vampire vanish, sans the smell of opium that was left in his wake. Within minutes, the Christian mob dropped down to the ground, awake, but dreaming. Tender fangs. Count Drugula woke up with an unusually cruel headache. He kicked open the coffin lid and tore off the heavy velveteen sheets that clung to his body, clammy from acid-addled perspiration. He glanced around his crypt and groaned at the state of disarray, silver goblets and drac-eye pipes simmering in the layer of blood covering most of the cold stone floor. It was dripping still from the faucets. Two dead and naked, ample-buxomed young sisters who hung next to each other, wrist shackles and iron rings on the dank wall.
"What an inordinate wastefulness of two such wonderful ladies."
At least, he consoled himself, their pre-mortem carnal triumvirate had been utterly gratifying before things derailed. Crawling out of his coffin, the Count went about for a cure to mitigate his miserable hangover. After a hearty breakfast of wine, meat, and a pipe of weed, his spirit had improved enough for him to begin plotting for more revelry. A grand feast. To-do list.
Invitations, drugs, trollops, meat, cow tongue, liver, heart, 4 barrels of Zybar, set out carpets and candelabras, fricat.
Carpathian crimson haze. The lush castle garden was situated on a terrace by one of the eastern towers, overlooking the small mountain village of Say-Least. It was an ideal position for Count Drugula to keep an eye on the rabble as they trudged on with their trivial lives, making sure they weren't up to any mischief against him. Cleaning the castle had taken a toll on his strength. He wished he had a servant to carry out the arduous tasks of dumping corpses, mopping blood off the floors, etc. But the prospect of hiring somebody had proven fruitless for the past 10 or so decades. Perhaps he could try and hire some Moldavian Cretan, for God forbid the sanctimonious clodhoppers of Say-Least would even consider it. Then again, every Transylvanian nobleman from Horodistia to the north to Zimnicia to the south knew the Moldavians to be nothing but a pack of cunning thieves. A content grin spread across his gaunt face at the sight of the plants that stood tall and proud, over a head taller than himself, and pregnant with fat, deep red buds. The odd strain, Carpathian crimson haze, had been cultivated in the garden for more than 300 years. It's a horrifying high, known to wake bloodthirst in its user, and it was the result of sativa seeds bred with the blood from virgins imprisoned in the castle dungeon. He had spent innumerable hours in the castle library, studying myriad notes and instructions, jotted down the family chronicles on how to properly nurse the weed. The meticulous procedures included everything from how to irrigate the plants with blood on certain significant dates to shaping and pruning. Entering the savory blush coppice, he began to pluck the buds and put them in a birch bark punnet. Though he preferred to carry out his garden duties at midnight, there was something particular about autumn morrow's bleak light that made his heart flutter in his chest. The punnet was nearly filled to the limit of its capacity when something swooped down from the stone tower's edge above and landed on the red bush. Startled, Count Drugula withdrew his knife-thin lips in fright, baring his fanged canines before noticing the small, grizzled bird. It was wounded. Limp it appeared. As it hopped around in a circle, he gently placed his punnet on a crumbling ledge and picked up the feathered creature, which he recognized to be a nightjar. His initial fright softened to sheer bewilderment as the bird squawked intently at him, clearly communicating some kind of message. This was indeed a compliment from Satan, a blessing to continue with what some men considered debauchery and decadence, but which in truth was a matter of survival. Just like his own kind needed to suck blood from humans, the whiskered nightjar needed to suck the milk of grazing goats. The Bagnio in the forest. Dressed in his finest velvet garb, Count Drugula proceeded with his feast preparations by cantering away in the moonless night. He had smoked a potent dose of opium before his department, and brought with him an ashwood box filled with red weed to be used as means of payment, or bribe rather, to ensure that his prominent guest's every demand would be met. He was to meet the nameless trollops, bone-white witches wearing dead animal masks. Driven out of town, they were condemned to live in a dingy wood house, the Casa Curva, seated deep in the silver fir forest, where many instances of human sacrifice had taken place in medieval times. Relentless rituals had given birth to ghosts haunting the crepuscular forest. The trollops stared through grimy windows at their nightly visitor dismounting his black demon courser. They admired his tall, majestic stature, his bleak complexion, his drooping mustache and long, stringy hair, and nearly swooned when he flapped his bat wings towards the cottage with a smile so cunning his crooked fangs were bared. The trollops' bushes dampened betwixt their varicose-veined legs. A mute witch wearing a bear mask walked out on the doorstep and banged on a troll drum, after which the Count was welcomed into the house of ill repute, a disease-festering hell that smelled of cheap wine and savory ass. As soon as weed was traded for services, an orgy of rare proportions began. Purple mist, thick smoke the guise of castle ruins dance inside the dilapidated brothel. Psychedelic charades as performed by evil imps. So high it surpassed even death. The Count was stripped of his leather garb, and with opium pipe in mouth and eyes red as a Carpathian sunset, was treated to oral sex from each of the 7 weed-horny witches. Bearhead, foxhead, fishhead, crowhead, harehead, sheephead, spiderhead. The deal was sealed. A dispute with the wine merchant. The corpulent wine merchant in Taliska was a man blessed by the fortune of knowing how to turn a good profit, a disposition that had earned him plenty of gold, but turned his heart black and his mind greedy. One misty morning the merchant picked up the distant clatter of hooves drawing near. The night before had been awfully crummy, shadowed by drunken violence as his young wife had refused him carnal pleasure. So, when Count Drugula had tied his steed and barged into the wine shop, he caught the merchant in a very bad mood. The Count stared silently at the merchant's bloody fists, raising a brow and lifting his bloodshot eyes to level with the man frowning behind the counter. Not uttering a word, the Count produced his list of demands. 4 barrels of Zybar. By the short time it took to show the paper and put the roll back in his vest, the sullen wine merchant's face had assumed the tone of a ripe plum. A moment later ensued a rather choleric quarrel between the two, regarding Count Drugula's tall heap of promissory notes of unpaid wine. The dispute, however, ended on a deadly note as the merchant's flustered spouse sneaked behind her better half and sank a foot-long dagger into his neck. So powerful was her stab, her entire hand rammed right through his windpipe and came out where should be his Adam's apple. Not only did the Count take an immediate liking to the feisty raven-haired woman and her shrewd ways, he was also delighted at the fresh blood that now gushed down in scarlet rivulets onto the polished floorboards. The long journey from the trollops in the woods had deprived him of his morning meal, so he kneeled and lapped up like a starved grimalkin. To thank the merchant's wife for the kind offering, he afforded her to smoke with him his last dose of opium. She willingly accepted his overture with gratitude as well as curiosity as to the effects of the black rubbery ball, which the bloodthirsty Count took out of a kit from his worn leather satchel. Shortly after chugging on the crowbone pipe, a dreamy veil floated above the shapely vendor lady and the tall, gaunt vampire, as they jointly ventured towards the realms of delusion. After a feverish love session on the merchant's Dupioni silk bedclothes, the woman provided Count Drugula with an apple cart, onto which they loaded the merchant's corpse, in addition to the 4 barrels of Zybar. Scalping Splendor. Before riding back to his castle, Count Drugula needed to make yet another pit stop. By a foothill bordering the 2,000-foot Ursa Peak, a few miles north off of Taliska, existed a grotto in which lived a hermit, a parchmenter whose craftsmanship was much sought after by the Count and his predecessors. Nearly every carpet beetle-infested page found in the thick volumes of the castle library had been manufactured by this solitarian, whose name remained obscured. Crossing a vast bramble moor, the Count reached the mouth of the grotto, the wispy moon lighting up the leaf-stitched twig door to the hermit's underground dwelling. And as the recognized custom bid, he climbed off his horse and waited. Soon glittered a pair of piercing black eyes behind the makeshift door, ogling the Count and his cargo. The old recluse let the travel-weary vampire inside. Descending a sloping tunnel, they came to the heart of the grotto. Here a burning fireplace crackled, casting tall shadows on the walls of the hollow space. In sparse addition to the burning wood was a cot, a few tomes, a large white oak basket filled with dried berries and conserved fruits, and in the center stood a sizable, delicately carved wooden frame with gut strings nailed into each of its 4 beams. This was the very mother instrument in the parchment-making process, used to stretch and dehair the raw hide of animals. Count Drugula smirked when he thought about how the hermit would react after his impending suggestion to use a highly unorthodox raw material for his particular commission of vellum. But before he could even breathe such a proposition, he needed to grease the parchmenter's callous palms. Before his leave-taking with the wine merchant's wife, she had offered him a bottle of Francusa, a fine gift he was now satisfied he had not indulged in during the draining journey to the foothill. The nameless old man's eyes sparked with jubilance as the Count fished out the deep green bottle from the inner pocket of his long velvet overcoat and handed it over. Witnessing an exquisite wine like Francuska being swigged right out of the bottle made the Count cringe. In the flash of a moment, he even considered killing the finesse-lacking heathen on the spot, but decided against it. The bottle depleted, the hermit was still alive, though his eyes had grown vapid. Timpul, Pentru, Actiona. It had begun to rain and thunder when the 2 eccentrics hauled the dead merchant's body into the cavern. Count Drugula smoked his last bud of red castle weed and fell asleep on the cot to dreams of spiders and flies, and of making macabre love with his sultry Countess of Brasov, while the hermit was removing the swollen skin from the vendor's body. Castle groundwork. A sheen of sweat coated Count Drugula's pale forehead after the drudgery of rolling the heavy wine barrels into the castle and down to his crypt where he planned to hold his festivities. He had decided against keeping it in the dining hall. The giant windows, no matter how dust-caked, let in too much light and would ruin the atmosphere he was aiming for. Furthermore, sunlight fatigued him, and he would have none of that. The blood from the tortured virgins in the last ritual had semi-clotted when he returned from his long country ramble. Thinning it down with wine, he discovered that he had managed to create an ink ideal for his next step of writing the invitations. A plucked feather from the injured nightjar served as a quill.
An outlandish fare. Something special is in the air. Save the date for a rare excursion into mind-altering realms and fleshly delights. A celebration uniting Transylvania and Wallachia. April 28th, 1803. At Castle Drugula, travel arrangements to follow.
After invitations had been sent, corpses disposed, and decorations contrived, the Count spent the remainder of the day in his coffin getting stoned and reading books about Romanian folklore. Dozing off to the image of Muma Paduri's bark-skinned face, he woke to the shrill din of bells which indicated the scarce occurrence of receiving a letter. His grim mouth bent upwards and his red eyes read the name of the sender, Costache. As he read further, he was pleased to learn that the chemist had synthesized a new substance of epoch-making importance. The Count's head spun with the thoughts of what this might pertain to. He could only guess, but with a man like Kostach, the possibilities were endless. And all of this fantastic news just in time for the feast. Saturn is aligned. Transformed hallucinogen. To reach Hateg, the decaying stone town in the heart of Hunadora, Count Drugula had to employ his bat wings for the nocturnal flight across the bear-ridden forest bordering the Carpathian Mountains. Though physically taxing as it was traversing in this fashion, especially after having administered myriad grams of weed, it was rather pleasant change from the irking joggle of a horseback. He even got some sleep during the smooth glide onto the pointed roof of the coy chemist's house. Kostach admitted the Count into his home in a fervent spirit. After some catching up over a glass of plump brandy, he abruptly ushered his honorable guest, and loyal customer, down to the basement laboratory. A pungent smell filled the cellar air, a stench unmistakably originating from the slew of seething, bizarrely shaped receptacles that spewed out a poisonous mix of black and purple smoke. Quite bored after Kostach's tedious rigmarole on phase reactions of drug metabolism, microbial catabolic diversity, the divine powers of ergo, fungus, etc., the Count was euphoric to learn that stormy-headed chemist had succeeded in altering his trademark brand of acid, his psychedelic brainchild, whose tenacious potency induced the outer visions that the Count had come to crave. Kostach handed over a tin box with 10 sugar cubes of the new acid, swearing it was 100 times stronger than its precursor. Count Drugula eagerly pinched one tablet between his taloned thumb and index finger, but was firmly advised against ingesting it before his flight back to Saylist. Humoring the chemist, he licked his lips and put the cube back in its box. But the warning had merely aroused his curiosity, and as soon as he had taken leave, he took a gamble and popped one anyway. Not many moments had gone by in the cold, starry night wherein he soared, before the new acid formula socked the Count in the head with the impetus of a god's fist.
This drug is designed by a psychotropic sadist.
His skin transformed into taut black bat skin covered in fine bristles, each hair pulsating in the spectrum of neon blues. His old pale flesh fragmented into jagged specks, a peeling puzzle sucked into the all-encompassing abyss, and beneath the layers of shed skin revealed his true nature, an electric bat. At breakneck speed, he thrashed forth in the dissolving strobe heaven, his new sense of sonar clicking madly in his disproportionately large ears as he shrieked out high-pitched echoes in search for prey. Thick gobs of saliva dripped from his fangs as bloodlust rampaged through his hideous body. And when a cluster echo bounced back at him, directing his unhinged gaze to the ground below, he spotted a silhouette of passive flesh. The electric bat swooped down. The hapless farmer. Florin the farmer was convinced he was doomed, ever since his wife Bianca had died after drunkenly stumbling into the pigsty, gone unconscious after hitting her head, and been devoured by the madder sow. Lady Luck seemed to have turned her back on the poor man. His beloved pigs died a short while after the bizarre tragedy, but Florin didn't give up. Rising from the ashes of grief, he had taken his last nickel and dime and bought himself 4 cows: Apple, Clover, Ginger, and Pickle. He prayed for their health and prosper every night before tucking himself in, and thus far, the cow's milk had flowed freely, enabling him to at least sell a little butter and cheese at the local market. Yet, the fear that some impending calamity was just around the corner was eating away at him. And so on the night of April 27th, Florin jolted awake in his bed from a moo so shrill and steeped in terror, every hair on his body stood on its end. Heart pounding in his barrel chest, he grabbed his loaded blunderbuss and headed outside in his nightgown. The sight he met as he reached the enclosed pasture was so grim, he fell to his knees, mouth gaping. There, Clover lay on her side, entrails spilling out of her ripped-open udder, by where laid a pale-skinned fiend with tangled black hair, lapping her blood while pulling out long threads of sinew, which he stuffed into his mouth, all while emitting a terrifying clicking sound. Turning his head away from this horror, Florin began to vomit uncontrollably. Then, with the repulsive taste of regurgitated mushroom stew lodged in the back of his throat, he felt 2 razor-sharp fangs sink into his neck. And the last thing he ever did in this hapless life was to curse whatever gods were operating in the woodwork. Death Residuum. The field in which Count Drugula roused was red and wet. Lumpy intestines replaced whatever flowers had grown there, and instead of soft spring grass was a carpet of meat and gristle. Scattered around him lay 4 slain cows, heads separated from their bodies, and 1 slain man, head intact, but hollowed out. All bodies had been cleared of their organs, hearts, livers, etc., which were stacked in a messy pile by a grindstone, a totem of a massacre ritual. The altered acid lingered still, but was abating by the second. Its effect merely saturated the reds and pinks in the pasture of carnage. The Count spotted a house beyond the field, but was too dazed to go over there and search for a bag big enough to fit his choice pieces of meat. Instead, he excoriated a cowhide and fashioned himself a makeshift sack, into which he stuffed the organs before he ascended the blush-dawn sky and flew back to the castle. A swarm of moths waved their dark wings inside his stomach. The feast was nigh. Zen at 0 hour. Count Drugula rose from his coffin at midnight, his crypt arrayed with drugs and gut. Carpets covered the chilling stones, candelabras burned in the dark, damp undercroft, wine laced with acid, a portent of blood and sexual sacrifice. High, naked trollops tied to instruments of torture. The Count laughed from acid psychosis. Punctured skin. He drank from the chalice of their miserable lives, and with Zen lethargy, stalked toward the castle door, whose knockers pounded loud.
Let the feast begin.
Postscript. Lair of Evil. Saliest, Transylvania, 1803. Dumitro had entered the decrepit village of Saliest alone, soaking wet and kaput. Though being a man of the cloth, the villagers shunned him due to the mad look in his eyes, a result after witnessing his older brother and each of his Christian companions commit suicide in the throes of the opium nightmare mist they were exposed to on the nettle field near the river. He didn't know why he was the sole survivor, or why God, who he had served all his life, would subject him to such cruelty. All he knew was that he had at last managed to hunt down the dope-fiend vampire, Count Drugula, whose castle's sharp silhouette rose like daggers against the soft, fiery dawn. Heart in his throat, Dumitro forced himself past the sturdy castle gate, and with stake held high roved through dismal corridors before he, guided by the scent of death and music of madness, was ushered down to the stronghold's underbelly, the crypt of Drugula. On the threshold, he thrust the stake into his own eyes. Below, the rapid glimpse of the devilish feast's partakers, drug-crazed noblemen and women fornicating, sticking red-hot iron rods into the vaginas of mass skeletal hags in bondage, while sodomizing each other with viscera, to the deranged cackle of the fanged conductor of this Symphonetta Infernalia, was forever stitched to his retina. There is no God. The end. Bonus recipe. Perfect for the red weed munchies. Trollop brain. 1. Remove a trollop's head. Take a sharp knife and gently peel the skin from the bone, from neck toward nose, watching not to cut the skin when you cut, not to break the eyes, taking them out whole. 2. After you have skinned, take out the brain, put on a board and chop well. 3. Then add 48 drams of fresh butter or lard, mint, marjoram, and thyme chopped small, 4 egg yolks, 24 drams of calf marrow, fresh cottage cheese, 1 liter, ground umbrella nuts, 48 drams, 24 drams currant, salt, cloves, pepper, nutmeg, and cinnamon. 4. Then take what is ground with what was chopped and mix these well with the brains and fill the skin, putting the eyes in their places and sewing it, the filled skin, so as to not waste filling, and put in a cauldron, adding meat stock, chopped herbs, onions fried in butter, spices and salt, and boil. 5. Once it is boiled, put on a plate and serve over slices of bread fried in butter. Sprinkle the bread with milk of umbrella nuts, mixed with sour cream and with lemon juice. Ornament the plate on the sides with fried tongues cut in slices, with slices of bread soaked in egg yolk, beaten with rose water, and fried in butter. Enjoy! This has been a presentation of Ravenwood Audio. Text copyright 2016, Michael Faun. Audio copyright 2016, Ravenwood Audio.